another. So keep that in mind. We started a new series last month in the book of Galatians. And as Paul is talking to the Galatian church is a group of people. It was a group of churches. It was a region. It's not one church. It was a group of churches that was founded by, I guess you would say, that region is founded by the Gauls. The Gauls were a group who were originally warlike. They came in, took over this land. They were originally like hired mercenaries. They were warlike, but over time, Rome had come in, had taken over their land, and had annexed their land. So by the time Paul is writing, it is now annexed to Rome, and they saw themselves as conquered. One of the things, though, as the Gauls were a lot like we are as Americans, one of the things that they valued was an idea that we truly value today too, and it is our freedom. As we're coming into the 4th of July, one of the big things that we celebrate is, as Americans, we are free. And the Gauls had got to a place where they felt like they had lost their freedom. They lost their freedom not only to Rome, but in a sense they were struggling with the same thing that the Apostle Paul had struggled with, where they had found themselves caught in a web of trying to please God. And how do you make the gods happy with you? And they felt in bondage. So as Paul came and he says, you have the right to live free, and you can live free. It doesn't matter whether you are conquered by another nation or not. You are free. And this message, it resonated with them. The only problem was, as Paul left, another group came in and said, Paul kind of taught you half the truth. He didn't finish telling you that if you really want to follow Jesus Christ, you've got to actually take on a nationality of Judaism or become like a Jew. You've got to do holidays. You've got to observe feasts. You've got to do sacrifices. There's other rituals that you must perform. Some of them were a bit painful, and they were confused, and many of them began to follow, saying, well, we want that freedom that Jesus offered. And Paul comes back and says, how foolish of you. How foolish of the guys who are teaching this, and how foolish of you to follow it. How can you, after you have found freedom, put yourself back into a bondage? All right. Now just hold on to that for a moment. And you might have noticed I got a little kind of setup on the side. And for those of you who know me, I have one of these passions in life, and it's coffee. Okay, in order to help understand where we're going today, I thought I would kind of fill in the rest of the story. When I originally started getting into coffee, here's how it went down. I was going through as a pastor, we were having some struggles in the church that we were in at the time. And as we were going through a struggle, I was just kind of wore out. And I found a coffee shop. I did not like coffee, but I found a coffee shop, and it was cool. It was nice. And I started with it was called a coffee frappuccino. It wasn't called a coffee frappuccino, but that's what we would refer to it as. The coffee frappuccino, it was cold, it was chocolatey, it was icy, it was just all things good. And I found I could go in, buy one, and sit down, and I gave myself permission to relax. And that cold dessert coffee began to change into a hot coffee, and I thought it was wonderful. In fact, here's something I don't tell too many people. I thought it was so wonderful. I went out and I also bought an espresso machine. The only problem is they don't tell you when you buy an espresso machine is that it's not as easy to make a good espresso as what. Okay, here's the reality. I have come across, and I hear about this all the time. If you get on the Facebook Marketplace, you're going to see all sorts of espresso machines that come on the market, because making an espresso is really more of a hobby than it is just simply get up in the morning and dump coffee in. And so I bought a little espresso machine, and I went and I bought coffee from It wasn't Walmart. It was Woolworths in Australia where we were at. So I bought coffee from Woolworths, and I began to try to make coffee. And I guarantee you this, it was nasty. And so you know what I did? I put that coffee machine into the cupboard, and I left it. In fact, I left it so long, I think the pump freezed on it, because if you leave coffee, you leave something that's a pump, you leave water in that pump, over time it dries and it seizes that little pump up. And in the end, I think I just threw, and I kind of look at it now and it kind of like breaks my heart, but I actually just threw it away because it's like, I can't make good coffee. Go down to the coffee shop, let them make you a coffee. Few years later, as I was starting to enjoy my coffee, I came back to the United States, and as we came back to the United States, things were going well until 2020 when something happened. Do you remember when the world fell apart? And shops were closing, and I couldn't go down, and it just felt wrong to go down to Starbucks and sit in a Starbucks and drink a coffee, or go down to Bon Beans, or go over to it just was wrong, and everybody else was closed. And I mean, so you know what I did? I did what all good people should do. I got online and started looking up, and I found, way over in Alabama, someone who did what I did, had bought a coffee machine and tried to make coffee and realized they couldn't make coffee, and you know what they did? They put it on Facebook Marketplace, and I said, I will try it again. Now, if I'm going to talk to you about making coffee, Dave, would you put up that next slide? We could stop and say this. When you're making an espresso, well, I could tell you this. Good espresso starts with good coffee beans. Good espresso requires a good grinder. Good espresso requires a scale. It requires a recipe. And it requires a machine to do it. Now, if I told you this and I said, all right, now you have all you need to make a good espresso at home, go and do it, you would look at me and do what? Don't be daft. There is a reality that as we begin to look at this, here's what I did. I just, so bear with me. Okay, I actually this morning, to kind of begin to tell you what I'm talking about, I'm going to stand behind it. Now, I'm not going to be, I even thought about actually bringing my espresso machine and setting it here, but I thought that might be a little bit too far. Good coffee starts with good espresso beans. Now, I'm just going to say this real quick. One of the best things that I can tell you about making good coffee is don't buy pre-ground coffee. It's old. Okay, now, there is no bad coffee if you like it, okay? Don't get me wrong. But I just want to say, there's something that I found that when you're making good coffee, it actually starts with good beans. Can I say this? The reality is even when you're finding good beans, most of the time when you buy them, there's a date on the back. And if you look at the date, most of them are old. And they kind of get a weird flavor after time. Just, okay. Number two, it requires a scale. I'm one of these absurd people that as I take my beans every morning. Now, by the way, I do this as a ritual. It's something for those of us who have ADD. Some people cannot take the time when you got ADD. It's kind of like you know what it does to me? It actually helps calm me down and help me to focus. When I stick to a routine, and so this actually helps my ADD. It's a weird thing. I can't explain it. But I take a scale every morning. I get a little jug, a little cup like this. I put my scale on, and I weigh out exactly 18 grams of coffee. Okay, that's where it starts. It then goes from here. I go over to, after I put it on the scale, I have this grinder. Now, this is not the grinder I use at home. This is just a spare one that I found because, as all good coffee guys, you got to have a spare grinder around, right? Because you never know when your one's going to break. So I have this grinder, and I take my 18 grams of coffee, which, by the way, this tub is made to carry a lot more than 18 grams. So I pour my 18 grams in, stick my cup underneath there, and I get 18 grams of coffee beans out. Close. As I do that, I then take my 18 grams of coffee, and on my machine, I have this thing. It's a portafilter, okay? You didn't know you wanted to know this morning, and you didn't know you were going to come to church to get a coffee lesson. I take my 18 grams of coffee, I stick it in there, I level it around, I fluff up my coffee beans, okay? Literally, I am this absurd with coffee in the morning. Every morning. And by the way, I do this with 2 cups because Holly gets a cup. And some morning, it actually turns into like 3 or 4 cups because I mess up a cup or 2 in the process and I have to start all over again. So I'll take this and I'll start shaking up this. And as I do, I'll get it and I'll level it off and I pull it and I'll make sure it's flat on the top. Now, there's several ways to do it. I've got a little distribution tool which I do it. But in the old days, you would take it and you take your finger and you'd start leveling it like this. So you level all your coffee beans around. Then I take that and I tamp it down, an even pressure. Okay. In that meantime, my coffee machine has warmed up. I pop that in there. I then take my scale, because I'm not done yet. I put it under the machine. And if I put 18 grams of coffee in, my recipe calls for a 2-to-1. So I want 36 grams of espresso to come out. Not only that, I want those 36 grams of espresso to come out in approximately 20 to 24 seconds. That's what I'm aiming for. And if it takes longer than that to get 36 grams of coffee out, I'm going, oh, it's starting to taste bitter. If it comes too fast, it starts to go hollow. Like, it doesn't taste right. It's like, okay, I want to tell you this. I know you do not care about my espresso ritual in the morning. I know it's not that important to you, but what am I trying to say? When Paul gets on and he gets to the Roman church and he says, I want you guys to live free. You've been given freedom, now live free. It's easy to go, yeah, but what do you mean by live free? That's like me telling you this. Good espresso, it starts with good coffee beans. It requires a good grinder. It requires a scale. It requires a recipe, and it requires a machine. That really doesn't tell you anything, does it? When Paul stops and he says, I want you to learn to live free, they're looking to go, yeah, but I don't get it, Paul. What do you mean by that? So what Paul begins to do is he begins to give them a picture of what freedom looks like. He doesn't just say live free. He says, I've got something I want to talk to you about, and you need to learn to live free, and here is what it looks like. So, if you've got your Bibles, or just look up online here for me real quick, I want you to just follow with me real quick, because Paul starts and he tells us this. He starts by giving us a picture, and in Galatians chapter 1, he says this. Now, you know, Paul had been with them several months earlier. He said, you had heard my story, but I'm going to refresh you again. I'm going to retell it. I'm going to re-give you the picture of what freedom looks like. And he says, you know my story. You know that when I followed the Jewish religion, I violently persecuted God's church. I did my very best to destroy it. In fact, I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the traditions of my ancestors. Paul is stopping a moment to say, here is the picture you need to see. There was this time in my life when I was bound by something. There is a past that kept me locked in. Now, hear me and be very careful when you hear this. The reality is what Paul was saying his past was, at the time, he actually saw it as something good. It's not that Paul was looking at it going, it was terrible. I was caught in drugs, and I was caught in alcohol, and I was caught in these addictions that I couldn't get. Paul was saying, no, there was this thing in my life. I actually thought it was really good. In fact, it was something I strived to become. I wanted to maintain the culture of my ancestors. I wanted to maintain the traditions that were handed down by Moses. And in order to maintain those traditions and in order to maintain my culture, I did something that I thought was going to help. I violently acted out towards others. I thought God was going to be pleased with me if I would, get rid of those who were hurting to traditions of my ancestors. It makes good sense, doesn't it? God needs violence and force to protect him. I mean, that's what Rome did, right? When Rome wanted to protect its borders, it brought on violence and force. And Paul said, the only way that I knew how to protect what I thought was good and great was to violently hurt and to destroy what was from God. Just for a second, as you think about what Paul did, and we all know the stories. If you don't know the story of Paul, tells us about the story in the book of Acts, and we're told about how he had some people put to death. He had people imprisoned. He'd confiscated lands from people, trying to stomp out this little group of Jesus followers. And as he's saying this, that I violently persecuted, I'm wondering if he's sitting there in the back of his mind, he can hear the voices. I wonder as he's saying this, whether he can see Stephen's face as he held the coats of those who stoned him. I wonder as he's saying this, I'm wondering if in the back of his mind he's hearing the voices of the wives and the children who he's arrested their dads. He's had them thrown into prison. He's had them moved out of Jerusalem and tried to move them on. I wonder if he can hear their voices in his head as he's saying this. But Paul says this is not what freedom is. In fact, what I realized is what I thought I was doing was good and great. I actually found myself imprisoned. I found myself imprisoned in this desire to try to please God, in this desire to stop and gain his approval, in a desire to gain control for my culture. And in this moment, Paul reminds them, but this is not my story. This was a part of my story. In fact, there's a bigger part of a story that is great. And he says this, and he continues with it in verse 15, and he says, but even before I was born, God chose me and called me by his marvelous grace. Paul's making a point that even before he was born, God loved him. God knew him. God loved him. God gave his life for him. When Paul was against him, God died for him. God loved him. When Paul was hurting others, God loved him. God died for him. And he moves on to say this, there's this thing that I found that was absolutely unreal. And we looked a little bit about that story last week, the story of how Jesus came and died, that he found this moment when he died for him. That God cared enough for us that he came to us. But Paul continues in Galatians 1:16, and he says, in this moment I discovered this amazing love, and he says, and it pleased him to reveal his son to me so that I would proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. Paul is reminding him that God had a purpose and a plan for his life. In the midst of Paul's brokenness, in the midst of Paul trying to gain control for his culture and his religion and his traditions, God says, Paul, I have something better. Paul is reminding us that there was a time in his life when he was enslaved by actually something that he thought was good. It was to his religion, and to his nationality. But the problem is that this moment caused him to see the world through a lens of fear. A fear that if he didn't do something, his nation was going to be lost. A fear that if he was not going to do something, that God was not going to be pleased with him. A fear that if he didn't do more, that he would not measure up. It was a fear that entrapped him. We don't know whether as he's sitting there in this fear, we don't know what it was doing to his emotions. Did it allow him to sleep at night? Was Paul in that spot where, hey, I go to sleep at night and all I can do is see the faces of those that I have harmed? Or even worse, he said, when I went to sleep at night, I could not see their faces and I could not hear their voices. In fact, I was proud of myself. Whatever it was, Paul said it was wrong. And it had me enslaved, it had me trapped. And he said, God reached into my life and he set me free. It set me free from the fear that I had that I could not measure up to God. It set me free from the fear of losing my nationality. It set me free from trying to lose my country. And in this moment, we're told that God gave him a new purpose. Now, as Paul is telling his story, he's looking out or he's talking to a group of people that he knows have their own story. No two stories are the same. Though our stories are different, there is a reality that we all find that is the same. We're all broken. The reality is before we gave our life to Jesus Christ, we find ourselves broken before him. We find ourselves broken because we cannot measure up to God. There is something that no matter how good you are, no matter how many awesome things you do, you will never do enough. Even those of us who sit there and say, we want to do good for others, I can tell you this. There are those who are so nasty that you go, I want to do good for everyone but you. Sometimes there are people who hurt us that we go, I want good for everybody but you. You see, there's a reality is that no matter how good we are, none of us will ever be good enough. We all know that there is something that just doesn't allow us to be perfect. All of us have things in our life that even no matter how good you are now, that if you were to go back into your past, there are things that you look at and they bring guilt, they bring shame on, and I guarantee you, as you come to church, you put it back and you stick it in a closet and you put a lock on it and you close it off because why? There are things in all of our lives that we are not proud of. There's something we said to somebody. There is something that we thought about somebody. There are things that keep us entrapped and enslaved, and Paul understood this. There are things that we just do not measure up. And to be honest, this is what he says in Romans chapter 3, verse 10. We already know this. But Paul says this in Romans chapter 3, verse 10. As the scripture says, there is none righteous, not even one. We know this. In Romans chapter 3, verse 10, Paul is talking to the Roman church saying, from the very start, we know that no matter how good we are really not that good. In fact, Paul continues and he says, not only do we not measure up before others, but we can never measure up before God. God by nature is perfect. And if I could be perfect, then I would be God. But I cannot be perfect. And so Paul continues on in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, and he reminds us of this little fact where he says, for everyone has sinned, for everyone has fallen short of God's glorious standard. Here's the reality. As Paul is talking about this freedom, he's pulling him back to a point. Paul thought he was doing what was good. There's a picture of Paul violently persecuting the church, of trying to destroy it, and God reaching into his life saying, Paul, I have something better for you. There's a moment when all of us accept the idea that there will be a day when we will have to stand before him. Do we ever stop and think about how good is good enough? Have I done enough to stop and say, God, this is what I did. Hey, you can accept me because my good is good enough? Or do we begin to think about in those moments as we accept this idea that we will stand before him, do we set that idea that those closets of our life that we've been locking up and hiding, they might break open? And there will be a standard that we will really be measured up to. You see, there's a freedom that Paul tells us about that sets us free from the fear of the guilt that we have towards others and the fear and the guilt that we have before God. Whatever the story is, Paul tells us a little bit more about this freedom in Romans chapter 5, verses 7 through 9. And he says this. Now, some people would not die, or most people would not die for a upright person or for a good person. Though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God shows his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners or still broken. And since we have been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. Paul is saying there is a freedom that we find in him because he pays a price for the shame and the condemnation that we find ourselves in. Our past, with all of its brokenness and imperfections, are paid for by the cross. Paul, though, stops and he says being made free is about being given a purpose. Being made free is not simply living a life that has no guilt or regret. Being made free is being given a purpose to live. Paul says, there was something I used to do. I violently persecuted those who followed Jesus Christ. In 1:16 he continues, and it pleased him to reveal his Son to me so that I would proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. And he moves on a little bit further in verses 23 and 24 and says this, all they knew was that the people were saying, the one who used to persecute us is now preaching the very faith he tried to destroy. And they praised God because of me. Being made free is not simply getting our past cleared. It's finding a purpose to live. Being made free is not simply having the guilt and the shame taken away. It's finding a purpose to live. For Paul, it caused him to share the freedom that he found. He wasn't traveling to tell others Jesus to gain God's forgiveness. He was traveling to tell other people about Jesus because he had found forgiveness. We all have a story. For those of us who have given our life to Jesus Christ, for those of us who have found forgiveness in the death and resurrection of Jesus, we've been set free. We may have found ourselves drastically broken in the past, Or we may have found ourselves as good people trying to do good things who just could never measure up. But in Christ, we're free. We no longer have to measure up. We have had our guilt and our shame covered by what he did for us on the cross. Now it is time to let go of the fear, the guilt, the striving, the trying to gain God. Now it is time to find a purpose for being set free. There's good news. Paul is saying, now that you have been set free, it is not to take on another religion. It is not to take on just simply taking on some more rules and regulations to gain God's favor. You need to live different because you have gained God's favor. Paul had a purpose to share what forgiveness looked like. What is your purpose? If you've given your life to Jesus Christ, this morning, if you have stopped and you found yourself forgiven from the brokenness that we've done towards others, and forgiven for that moment of trying to gain God's acceptance, what is your purpose? Why are you set free? Paul gives us a picture of what freedom looked like for him. No longer was he there to gain God's goodness, for God had given him his goodness. No longer was that past, the account of the violence that he once did, held against him. God said, it is forgiven. And by the way, I'm sure it's still stuck in his mind. But he said, I have been forgiven, and I need to share it. What is your purpose? If you've given your life to Jesus Christ, what is your purpose for being forgiven? What does his death and resurrection mean to you? You see, Paul tells us that freedom helps us find our purpose. Now, espresso. I want to guarantee you this. You will not become as absurd as I am about coffee. Maybe someone will become slightly obsessed with coffee. But the reality is it does no good to simply buy a machine and be told, don't go make good coffee. You need to see it in action. You need to have it explained to you. The truth is learning to live free is simply more than saying you're free, now live it. Paul says, this is who I was. This is what Christ has done for me. And he begins to give a picture. And it's still not that simple, is it? Because as we begin to go into next week, we're going to look a little bit deeper as the freedom that even those who knew better found themselves going back to entrapment. Come back next week, part 3. Let's